Senator Scullion.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise to also make a contribution to this Greens bill. If I could just briefly respond to Senator Stirl. I gave you a bit of a touch-up on February the 9th, mate, about this matter, and I think that'll probably end it. I think it is time when our Australian industry, and in fact the whole through the chain of the industry is threatened by this sort of legislation in this place, that we should stand shoulder to shoulder to reject it. I can remember, it's one of those times, you know, where were you when? I can certainly remember when the secession of the trade happened. I was in Sydney Airport, and I remember viewing both Julia Gillard and Paul Henderson, and I knew in my heart that this was going to have a real impact on the territory, you know, and for whatever the good reasons of the movement, it was just going to be a big deal. And I certainly wasn't wrong. It had a huge impact, and that impact continues to this day. I know it's not on the news every day, we don't talk about it here every day, but the men and women, their families and communities of right across the north of Australia who rely on the live cattle export are still in real strife. They're still in real strife. And we all accept that the vision that we saw on the Four Corners program was very disturbing. It was very disturbing for many Australians. I mean, I think that whilst the government, and we've just heard from the government, I think they acknowledge that perhaps that wasn't the best possible decision. And I've undertaken to Senator Searle, I won't dwell on that too much, so I'll stick to that. But I think we certainly joined in the notion that we certainly don't tolerate the mistreatment of animals. Everybody's accepted that. And it's interesting to try to think about, perhaps I'd encourage the Green to think about why that is. Why that is in Australia we actually have a particular affection. In fact, in a number of countries, and it's good to see a couple of kids up in the gallery, you'll certainly know, it's not everywhere in the world that we're brought up with horses that talk. You know, it's not everywhere in the world we're brought up in our vernacular, we're brought up with kids, with cartoons, where all the animals are Disneyfied. Everything we meet, they're humanised. They talk, they drive cars, it's all part of our upbringing. And it's part of an affluent upbringing. It's an affluent upbringing. We have access to television and movies and comic books and those sort of things. Is a characterisation of a very affluent community. Because of this Disneyfication, if you like, of how we see animals, that's affected our culture. And it's not only the animals we see and we live with, and of course we have an affection for the animals we live with, whether it's a dog or a cat or a budgie or whatever they are, we have a great affection because we live with them and we love them and we talk to them, we don't talk back, but it's a very, very close affection. But this culture is not, it's a culture where we can afford to feed a dog and feed a cat. That's how they stay with us, and we love them. And we spend quite a lot of money in this country on feeding our pets because we're a very affluent community. But of course, in places that we often export to, that affluence just isn't there. They can't afford to have a cat and a dog, and you know they're doing it pretty tough actually feeding themselves. And for those people in places like Indonesia that I know well and visit, they're quite astounded to hear that we spend as much as we do on pets, and it's just not part of their culture. But of course, as they gain more affluence, and all countries around the world gain more affluence, their culture changes. And we've seen cultures change, certainly in my life, from those people who thought a democracy was so far away out of their ilk, and yet they now enjoy a democracy. So cultures do change. And it's interesting to see how cultures change. And cultures change because they are affected by other cultures. You go and talk to other people about things and you're influenced, whether it's your mate next door, or it's another country, or it's another view or another idea. When you're exposed to it, your mind's open to change. The world's changing all the time. And in terms of animal welfare, of course, that's going to be something that is going to change in the future. And it's actually a function of behaviour in Australia that has changed much of the attitudes towards animal welfare right across the world. And whilst I've been pretty critical, not particularly supportive of the move to stop the exports, I suppose in some ways it was associated with being able to demonstrate that we really needed to lever some change in regard to the treatment of cattle, particularly in Indonesia. And it's not only talking about welfare, because there are other practical benefits, and if they're practical individuals and people who work in agriculture and the processing sector, I guess generally you describe as practical people. I don't know why I use that term, probably everyone's pretty practical. But they're practical people, so we have other things we can sell. So it's not only about how the animal feels, and if you're not all that interested in animal welfare at the moment, you can say to them, well, you know, when an animal is calm and an animal is well looked after, and you have the infrastructure to move an animal smoothly to the point of process, then that's really good for people because you don't get as many injuries. So it's a very practical process. You can also explain from our processing what we know is that if an animal is calm and if an animal moves calmly and safely and its welfare is looked over, at the point of processing it's not upset and annoyed and full of adrenaline. And we know about adrenaline, but perhaps we don't know a lot about is lactic acid. And you know, you get a bit sore the next day when you overuse the muscles. That's what you're trying to get rid of. Lactic acid, when it's not out of your system, because the animal's now being processed, actually increases the carcass temperature by up to 10%. Now, you think, oh, that's all pretty interesting. Well, for a processor, if you've got to chill that meat, that's a significant increase in the cost of power. So welfare is not only a story about exchanging our culture and trying to change the way we do business in other countries, it's also being able to point out what, you know, the experiences of Australia. Because we have this animal welfare process, there are a whole range of benefits. Now, I can recall pretty much straight away after the secession of trade, being a Territorian, pretty important to us in the Northern Territory, I skipped over there. I went over to Indonesia the next week. And, you know, going through the wet markets in Indonesia with a spattering bahasa, I can tell you it was not a really good place to be. And it wasn't because people were angry, they just couldn't understand. You know, there are lots and lots of racks under which used to hang meat that housewives and people who are in the business of food production, these little stalls that get around Indonesia, would come there in the morning, and then this morning there was no meat. They don't stay constantly tuned to Sky News. All they know is when they got there, their livelihoods on which they depend wasn't there. And they said, why? And so they're asking me, why? Why would you not want to send meat to us? You've always done it. We've bought it. It's all part of a process. Your nation supplies our nation with protein, and we've relied on it. We've become dependent on it. And it was a very difficult situation. But the observations I also had there, that when I left, there was a certain feeling in Australia that every time we send one of our live animals to Indonesia, you know, it's beaten around the head with a chain and it's all pretty horrible. Now, I won't go into the footage that was shown. I just don't think it's necessary, but when I actually visited and looked at some of these processes, what we saw on that certainly wasn't the norm. But you do have places where culturally people will allow things to happen. We'd been exporting animals to Indonesia for a very long time, and it had by and large been done pretty successfully. Clearly, there were those abattoirs and processors that weren't recognising the need to ensure that our standards were adhered to. But I understand now at least 85% of the cattle, as a consequence of the changes in the culture that we've provided, the Australian culture that we've provided, has now made significant changes. So I think we need to see the opportunity, and it's an opportunity that this bill doesn't allow. And I know the Greens are pretty keen to say, look, let's stop all live animal exports. Let's stop all animal exports. But I'd like people to see animal exports at the moment, and I'd like to see the opportunity of animal exports. We're not only exporting animals, but let's start thinking about the export of our culture, about how we go about business, sharing the technology as we've done in Indonesia, sharing the technology as we're now doing in Egypt. And for all those people who are passionate about the welfare of animals, I understand that you are also passionate about the welfare of animals all over the world, not only in your backyard, not only Australians, and I applaud that. As an Australian, I applaud that. I have to acknowledge I wasn't brought up in Australia. I saw most animals as a built-in lead and a telescopic sight at their head, but Africa was a different place to be brought up than this. We saw it as food. But in Indonesia, we can really change the culture by going down the road that we've gone down. We've got a full chain stream that's now scrutinised by everybody to ensure that when they leave the farm in Australia, how they're transported on the truck, how they're transported on the boat, the potability of the water, how many times the air actually changes in the boat every minute, they're all able to be measured, and they all meet a very, very high standard in terms of animal welfare. Having been on the vessels, having been in Indonesia, having spent much of the time on the farm, and spent much time on the trucks, I can personally validate for myself, that's not something that someone tells me, that's something the industry is completely focused on. Completely focused on. So at a time where we're now seeing the adoption of our cultural approach to animal welfare, and we're seeing the adoption of significant regulation and assistance not only in Indonesia but anywhere in the world that receives Australian animals, that this would seem to be the worst possible piece of legislation at the worst possible time. And as I say, I applaud all those people who say, listen, let's look after the animals not only here but everywhere. But if we stop that, if this piece of legislation is enacted and we say, OK, no more live export, what are we condemning the future of animals that are overseas, if that's what you believe? Well, you're condemning to much of the same, which is not our cultural approach, which is not our welfare approach. And I think it's just simply been poorly thought out, and sadly, I think not only Animals Australia but RSPCA, it's an organisation I used to support and my children used to support as they grew up, and sadly they don't now for a number of reasons. My son's principally duck shooting, my daughter's other reasons, but me because they become a subscriptions-driven organisation. And like all subscription-driven organisations, I've become more and more cynical about why they get involved in processes. If you can go onto their website to have a look, the first thing they'll tell you is how to give us money. And sadly, I've had far less confidence in their motivation. And if I could just touch on Senator Rhiannon touched on the wonders and how much money we're all going to make in Northern Australia if only we knocked up a couple of abattoirs. Look, you can commission reports, Senator Rhiannon, that will tell you not pretty much anything, but they will say, look, I don't know what you're doing this for. All you have to do is knock up some abattoirs, kill 400,000 animals a year. We'll have a couple of 100,000 left over. I'm not sure what you do with them. But suddenly we're all going to make another 104 million and we're going to have another 1,600 employees. Well, as Senator Searle indicated, that we've had abattoirs. We've had in Broome and in Derby and Katherine, and they've all gone broke. They've gone broke simply because with the cost of labour there's a whole range of issues. There's one being proposed at the moment just outside of Darwin by AOCO, and we'll see how that goes. The price of the dollar remains the same. I suspect that is also not going to be a goer. But to notionally say, well, look, the unions and RSPCA really support simply building abattoirs and stopping this trade, people need to understand that this trade is based on producers where the systems in these extensive places. I drive along fence lines 100 kilometres long on one fence line on one paddock. You only see the cows once a year. How are you going, girls? And they all come in. All the girls have got babies. They do a bit of running around, swap them over. Those that we saw last year all get on the boat and go. We sort them out and we'll see you all later. It's not a particularly personal experience. They're off into the rigours of the territory. And all that country can do, though, is breed. It can turn over animals and we can produce plenty of animals. It won't fatten one to steak, because by the time you get to November, the crackers, the old cracker cows, they've got to struggle through that terrible time between November and December. But you can't fatten them there. So the only place to fatten them, of course, is we've got to send them away somewhere, put them in a feedlot and put them somewhere where there's some grass. Because whilst it might look wonderful and green in the Northern Territory, it's not particularly good fodder for cattle. It's not particularly good feed. So it is important to understand that. And so the cattle that these abattoirs are supposed to kill, they're not killing cattle. They haven't been finished. There's no money in that. There's no profit in that, and there's frankly no sense in that. And if I could just touch briefly on the issue that Senator Rhiannon spoke about for a moment about self-sufficiency, Senator Rhiannon. Because there's no trade now, and there's been a substantial devolution in the trade, what has happened is that the price has gone up of demand. And so the local cattle, who used to take up 10% of those cattle going into the feedlots, has now increased to 60%. So in terms of self-sufficiency, building a herd, this is working the exact opposite direction. So the breeders and the Indonesian herd are now getting eaten. That's what's happening. So this is in reverse. So in terms of self-sufficiency, this move has actually made them go backwards. And if we were to accept your legislation in this place, would make it go further backwards at a greater rate of knots. I can just touch on some of the damage in terms of the last decision, and only in relationship to what's being proposed by the Greens. It wasn't only a personal relationship that I reflected of in my time in the wet market, but it was also, if I can just reflect briefly on what it did with the relationship to Indonesia as one of our strongest, nearest and dearest neighbours. And for those who don't know who I am, where I come from the Northern Territory, which is actually South Asia. I go for a weekend in Singapore because it's 2 hours closer than Sydney. So we live in a place where that relationship is very close, it's very strong. And of course for the Indonesian government to suddenly hear that we were doing this was a pretty appalling process. Now I'm not sure if Senator Rhiannon has actually spoken to the Indonesian government about what they're proposing, but I think it would add insult to injury if we were to pursue this without reference to the Indonesian government, and I suspect that has in fact been the case. Senator Searle very articulately touched on a number of the issues associated with some of the people who really need help and who are emerging as a very vital force in the live cattle export trade, and that's our first Australians, Indigenous Australians. The Indigenous Land Corporation is a great success story in Indigenous affairs. I slap them around a bit from time to time, but by and large they do a fantastic job. They actually own a herd of about 100,000 cattle, and that's on 8 properties located from Queensland through the Northern Territory right across to Western Australia. They own Roebuck Plains yards, massive, most modern yards anywhere, fantastic amount of infrastructure. Now that's just one property. They've got a workforce of 150 people, of which some 60% is Indigenous. That's one property. That's one holding, sorry, there's 8 properties. There's 50 other Indigenous-owned properties across the top under which we are seeing real reconnection. Instead of the disconnection from country, they're reconnected with country, they're reconnected with employment, they're reconnected with all the benefits of life, and particularly what a constant stream of income will provide. Now sadly, they've had a bit of a knock. And again, I promise not to go into that knock, but that's given all of us, including government, I suspect. You do these things, you've got to learn from these things. And given that we've sort of knocked us off their feet in North Australia at the moment, to now say, oh, by the way, nada, it's all gone. There'll be no more export of live cattle. Look, next time you're up there, I know you'll be up there, Senator Siewert, you spend a lot of time up there and I've got a lot of time for you, but you might wish to explain to some of the Indigenous stockmen I know that you know and you have a fair bit to do with, about why you want to stop their industry. You might want to point out to them perhaps some other alternative. I'm not sure what it'll be, combing trees or something, but I think it is a really important responsibility you need to take for this. The Greens need to take responsibility for the consequences of the legislation that I suspect they bring before this place, knowing it will never succeed to somehow say to those subscribers that support RSPCA and other organisations, other subscription organisations, see, we look after animals, we love animals, so perhaps you should send us some money. I'm not really sure. But I could just conclude by saying this is an absolute shocking piece of legislation that could never be supported. And what we really need to do is to ensure that we work together to make sure
Senator Scullion,
no further
your
piece
time
of
has expired.
legislation like this appears.